All right, well, good afternoon, and welcome to the Center for Global Development. My name is Erin Collinson, and I'm the Director of Policy Outreach here at CGD. And I want to start by thanking you all for joining us today. I'm really excited about the discussion we have teed up, both because it's an opportunity to delve into trade issues, which I think frankly get short shrift when it comes to conversations about US development policy, but also because we get to do it with such a terrific panel. And I'm going to introduce our panelists in just a second here. But what really stood out to me is that not only do they have deep expertise and impressive credentials, but they're also quite skilled at breaking down complex issues and making them accessible for a wide range of audiences. And I think with trade in particular, that takes a real talent. So on the far end, we have Chad Bowen, who is the Reginald Jones Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. His research examines many elements of trade, international laws, institutions, negotiations, disputes. And Chad previously served as a senior economist on the White House Council of Economic Advisors, as well as a lead economist at the World Bank. And prior to that, Chad had a successful career in academia as a tenured professor of economics at Brandeis University, with a stint as a visiting scholar at the World Trade Organization. You may also know Chad from Twitter and from Trade Talks, the excellent podcast he co-hosts with Soumaya Keynes of The Economist. And next we have Kim Elliott, who is a non-resident fellow here at CGD, as well as a visiting scholar with George Washington University's Institute for International Economic Policy. And Kim has authored and co-authored a number of books on trade policy and globalization. And in 2009 and 2010, she chaired the CGD working group that produced the report Open Markets for the Poorest Countries, Trade Preferences That Work. Kim spent several years as a senior fellow here at CGD, as well as with the Peterson Institute. And it was a paper Kim published this summer on developing a more inclusive trade policy that really provided the inspiration for this event. And finally, we have Todd Tucker, who is a political scientist and fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, and as well as with Roosevelt Forward. His research focuses on political economy, democracy, and judicial politics. He published a book last year on politics and development in international investment law. And prior to pursuing his doctorate as a Gates-Cambridge scholar, Todd analyzed trade policy as a research director at Public Citizen. I'm really happy to have you all here. So now elements of trade policy seem to be in the news a lot these days. And I'm going to ground many of my questions on the current administration's approach to trade policy, but I hope we can have sort of a forward-looking discussion as well. And I'm going to start by asking the panel some questions, but after that we'll open it up to the audience, so we hope you'll be ready. So first, and I hope everyone will weigh in on these first two, and then we'll do a few more directed questions. The Trump administration has taken a variety of actions, whether it's threatening to impose tariffs on exports from a number of trading partners, at times aimed at achieving objectives that are well outside of the trade relationship, or using national security as a justification for tariff hikes. And these have contributed to an increase in, I think, global trade uncertainty. But while many of the actions taken by the current administration are unusual, the administration has justified them as necessary to ensure gains for American workers. So my first question is really twofold. Is the current approach to trade policy working for most Americans? And where do you expect the Trump administration's approach to trade policy to have lingering effects globally, especially for developing countries? Who wants to kick it off?
Well, why don't I start? Because I wanted to maybe provide a little bit of context for the current situation in terms of U.S. trade policy, and just point to something that I think a lot of people maybe don't realize, that aren't deep into trade details, and that is that the normal U.S. trade tariff structure discriminates against poor people, both in this country and in developing countries. And that's because the average U.S. tariff is quite low, well under 5%, but there are a number of exceptions to that, and the exceptions tend to be certain agricultural products, clothing and footwear in particular. And those, of course, are items that poor people, they're necessities. Poor people have to consume those things. And so a disproportionate part of their consumption basket is going to things where they have to bear the cost of high tariffs. Similarly, those are things that are labor-intensive manufacturers where developing countries have a comparative advantage in producing, could produce and export more of if not for these tariffs. So that's sort of the first layer. And just to give a couple of examples, I was talking to somebody in a meeting earlier today about the tariffs that are likely to go into place against the European Union because of the Airbus-Boeing conflict and dispute. And she mentioned that, the tariff on acrylic sweaters, which is now going to go up by 25 percentage points, is already at 32%. It tends to be acrylic sweaters, a less expensive item that poorer people might be able to buy. That's in contrast to cashmere sweaters, where the tariff is only 4%. So even within a tariff structure that discriminates against poor people, you have these further sort of adding, insult to injury. So that's sort of just the background of where the trade structure is not helpful. I think the current trade wars are just adding to that. Of course, we're now seeing how tariffs are a tax on consumers as more and more go into place on more and more imports from China that are driving up costs. There's new data coming out on how it's affecting the manufacturing sector negatively rather than positively, so it's not helping workers overall. What we need to do to help workers is better domestic policies. And here again, I heard from a friend yesterday he couldn't come to the event, but he wanted to give me some data on federal support for workforce training, and pointing out the fact that the federal support for that training has dropped by 1/3 since 2000. So we're doing less of what we should be doing and more of what is not being particularly helpful. And in the context of developing countries, we do have programs like the Generalized System of Preferences and the African Growth and Opportunity Act that are supposed to help give developing countries more of a leg up in terms of exporting to the US. But if you take that general program, the GSP, it excludes all of those high tariff products that I just mentioned a minute ago. So it's not at all helpful. AGOA, special program for Haiti, those are a little bit better, provide more access, but they still have a lot of problems that if people want to go into in the discussion, I'm happy to. And then the final thing is sort of the lingering effects of the Trump trade policy, and where I'm most concerned is really in terms of what it's doing to the multilateral trade system, which is rooted in the World Trade Organization, and the fact of imposing unilateral tariffs that are violating our obligations at the WTO in terms of using national security as a rationale for those tariff increases, which puts a big loophole that any country can then use to impose tariffs. And then also there's some technical stuff around the dispute settlement system at the WTO, where the Trump administration is also threatening to destroy that whole system. The real concern there is that whole multilateral system is now at risk, and that should be, anyway, a particular concern to and for developing countries who then are subject, if that system is weakened or even disappears, have no recourse to bullying and discriminatory policies from the rich and powerful countries. So that's where I'm really most concerned about the potential long-term effects of what we're seeing going on now in trade policy.
Okay. Well, so as a political scientist, I do a lot of thinking about the politics of trade, often more than sort of the strict economics. And one of as to your point, your question about sort of the lingering effects, I think that this is a conversation that's happening a lot in Washington now about sort of, what will we sort of see a pivot away from sort of Trumpist kind of economic policies on trade? Were Democrats to win, or were another Republican to come along? And I think that, one of the things to remember, I had the misfortune some time ago of being involved in a project of coding political ads in House of Representative and Senate races, and I had to watch about 1,000 different videos on YouTube. It was mind-numbing. It was awful. But one of the things that I noticed is that a lot of these messages of sort of trade destroying jobs, trade being bad for sovereignty, was a Democratic message, especially a congressional Democratic message for a very long time. So it's actually more of a case of sort of Trump taking sort of a Democratic talking point that we saw Bernie Sanders use in the primary campaign in 2016. So I think that there will be some continuity. But what that's going to look like is really anyone's guess. I mean, you can kind of think of trade policy as involving three different sort of separate strategic issues. One is kind of the strictly economic, who wins, who loses, size of the pie. Another bit is foreign policy, sort of how does trade serve as a foreign policy signaling instrument? And third, kind of what's the vision of governance that's kind of embedded in trade agreements and trade policy. And that has to do with all the kind of non-tariff things, aspects of trade that Elizabeth Warren and others like to talk about. So, Obama clearly had a message that sort of took all three legs of that stool, about sort of the new digital economy, about foreign policy in Asia, about setting the rules of the road so that China can't. You see Trump having kind of an inversion of that message, talking about trade being bad for sovereignty, and we're losing all these jobs, and our foreign competitors are laughing at us at the negotiating table, right? He had sort of a stool set up of his own as well. And I think what I haven't seen looking through the Democratic candidates' platforms in this coming race is anything that really approximates a coherent message on all three of those elements. They might sort of focus a little bit more on jobs or focus a little bit more on sort of government restructuring, but not sort of something that kind of coheres in a way that quite frankly will be as competitive with the very easy slogan that Trump will have if we are to have debates. Who knows if we will or not. But anyway, yeah.
So let me go back to the first part of your question, Aaron, which was is the approach of the Trump administration working for most Americans? And there I would say probably no, but I think it's certainly working for some Americans. So I think trade, and again, I'm an economist, and this will be my general take on things. And I should also say that it's a huge pleasure for me to be up here, both with Todd, of which I'm a huge fan, and also Kim, whose work I've been reading and admiring and learning from for decades. I'm sorry. So it's a huge pleasure for me to actually be here. But the way economists think about trade is more trade does grow the pie, but it has distributional implications. There's going to be winners and losers. And with the Trump administration's approach and all these tariffs, they're effectively shrinking the pie, but there's also distributional implications. And so there are going to be winners and losers. And so, if we're talking about steel workers, yes, they're probably benefiting from President Trump's policies. But there's going to be lots of other workers in the economy that aren't. Workers that require steel or require the inputs from China that are now having to pay higher costs because of these tariffs, that are now finding it more difficult to compete with goods or services produced in other countries, in Japan or in Europe and Germany, that don't have to face these tariffs. So there are distributional consequences, and there are going to be winners and losers, just like there's winners and losers from trade. That really hasn't been, I don't think, part of the discussion, as Todd indicated. It's the narrative about trade, the politics of trade, I think are very, very distinct from the economics necessarily. On the question of effects on developing countries, and so I will echo what Kim said, and I think we'll talk a bit more about some of the specific ways in which developing countries are going to be negatively impacted by the erosion of a rules-based, non-discriminatory, multilateral trading system, if that's the direction in which we're heading, and that's certainly the path in which we're on. I'm optimistic that things could change, but I agree that that's worrisome because it is the path that we're on. In terms of specific examples, the one that jumped out to me very early on the administration in their tariff policy was thinking about what they did on steel. The tariffs they imposed on steel, there was this national security argument, which is an erosion of international norms, but in many respects, lots of administrations over the last 40 years have imposed protection on steel. Democrats and Republicans, just takes different forms. But what was very different about this time around relative to, say, when the Bush administration imposed tariffs on steel back in 2002 is there were protections then for small developing countries. The way they did it, following the rules of the WTO, following the agreement on safeguards, is you're supposed to carve out all of the poor, small suppliers of steel out there in the world and not hit them with tariffs. And that's what they did. And that's important because the impact of tariffs, the impact of these extra costs is more acute on the small countries and companies that can't afford to engage in that world. And this time around, when the Trump administration did tariffs, they didn't carve out poor countries. They didn't carve out developing countries. And when you look at the data, they were the ones that were kind of most negatively impacted earliest. And so, I do think there's going to be, when this is all said and done and we're able to empirically assess the impacts of this, there's going to be both systemic impacts that are going to negatively hurt the poorer and more vulnerable countries out there that are reliant on a rules-based system, but also negative economic impacts on them as well.
Thanks. So one of President Trump's first acts after taking office was to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. But then he proceeded to renegotiate NAFTA, producing the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which in some ways is broadly similar. So this suggests, I think, a degree of bipartisan support, at least within the executive branch, for a sort of common free trade agreement template, even amid, as you alluded to, this public concerns about whether it's substance or process, and I think the disconnect between the politics and the economics. So on substance, does there need to be some rebalancing of trade agreements to benefit, spread the benefits more widely, both at home and abroad? And kind of sounds like yes, but how? And then on process, could more transparency and accountability really help engender greater support? And what would that look like?
Should I go? All right. So on the point about the similarity between different trade agreements, it's interesting. There's a good paper that just came out from Manfred Elseg and Todd Alley that looked at sort of the text of a wide universe of trade agreements and found that it was basically 80% similarity across the whole universe of treaties, and in a subset it was up to 95% similar. So it is really common, and I also had them take a look at the TPP versus China's bilateral investment treaties, because remember Obama sort of said, we're so different than what China's doing, we have a different set of rules, but that also was sort of 80% similar. So there is a lot of similarity. There's important differences for sure in the details, but there is a lot of similarity. I think the way that I think about sort of rebalancing trade policy is, first of all, recognizing that it's become about a lot more than tariffs and sort of traditional trade issues. NAFTA 2.0 has a few dozen chapters that cover a lot of different themes having to do with environment, labor, kind of a whole range of things. And I think it may be time to stop thinking of these as trade agreements and more as just economic cooperation agreements writ large. And I think that there's a very lively debate about kind of what goes in and what goes out if you were to kind of come up with some new template. I think some of the things that I hear a lot, and I think there are strong arguments for, are bringing some of the Paris climate obligations into the universe of these economic cooperation agreements to make them more enforceable, more meaningful, right? Doing something with anti-monopoly and antitrust issues in these agreements, especially addressing international taxation issues. This is a huge area where we need more international cooperation. So I think that there's a lot of different ideas percolating about things to go in above and beyond sort of just the tariff issue. And then I think on process, if the goal is to sort of make trade policy more legitimate in the eyes of a wider range of stakeholders, which I think would be a good thing. I think that you want to sort of look at how the current system has worked to mobilize the interests that defend it, right? So having advisory committees with special access to negotiating documents, having rights like the book that I wrote on investor-state dispute settlement, where companies are able to directly challenge governments outside of the normal intergovernmental process. And it turns out that if you want to have a broad and quick diffusion of international rules and norms, a great way to do that is to get diplomats and bureaucrats out of the way and just allow the interested parties to directly begin developing a new body of law. So if you want to see something like that on the labor and environmental side, you could do a lot worse than giving those kind of rights also to labor and environmental groups. And then they have a stake in the system that they'll work to defend later on, which is what we've seen with the agreement so far, that the proponents of it really get something out of it. So they have a stake and then fight against any effort to kind of roll it back.
Sure. So let me maybe say a couple of things. One on, maybe I'll start with process. I agree. I think the process and engagement that we've had in the United States has been horrible. Trade is massively unpopular. Nobody feels like they have any say, and it's amazing. There is this advisory process that seems to, even in different administrations, not work all that effectively or not seem to be all that transparent, even though there are a wide array of stakeholders and interests that get represented on these things. There are union interests, there are environmental interests on some of these committees, and yet they seem to play a very little role, a very small role. With this administration, it appears that that all of these groups are playing less of a role, that the administration is seeking less outside input into their formulation of policy. I mean, I think we all hear stories about even how the basic interagency process that normally takes place, at least on the trade side, doesn't seem to be functioning the same way in this administration either. So I think there's a lot of room in general for the United States to improve in this area that's really only been heightened by the last 3 years. I've actually been the last 2 years. The European Union does things a little bit differently, and some of it's cosmetic, but I think it's actually a bit beneficial. So in the fall of each year, they have what they call EU Trade Day or something. It's a big event in Brussels. It's basically an open house for civil society to come in they have panels and where they kind of force Commissioner Malmstrom and other high-level officials to basically sit on panels with lots of different representatives from civil society, from environment, from labor, from the business community, and engage directly on these topics and through Q&A. And it's a huge group. I've been the last couple of years, and it's fascinating, right? I'm not going to say that they're directly changing their trade policy because of this input, but it makes these communities, I think, feel as though they have greater input into the process than we do necessarily in the United States side. So I think there's some lessons there, at least in terms of engagement, that we might draw. The last point that I want to make about is on this process of the main lessons from USMCA, which I think was part of your initial question. Kind of watching. And I agree with Todd. Most of these agreements are the same. There's very little that's changed. And I'll complain as an economist about USMCA as both kind of wasted opportunity to do things, but then also some of the tweaks that have been done are going to make it more trade restrictive in ways that aren't necessarily beneficial. But that being said, it's not a huge game changer. And yet the way the administration is selling it, especially to workers, as if this is going to be transformative somehow. And my concern is that's just false hope, and it doesn't at all address the true underlying problems that we have, in the labor market, in the United States. And as Kim pointed out, the key areas of where we need to fix things are all on the domestic policy front, on labor mobility, on education and retraining, some of which is not necessarily just labor market policy, but other complementary policies as well, maybe having to tackle things like anti-competition in monopoly power and those types of things. And so promising somehow that USMCA is going to fix all of the problems that led to the 2016 election in which trade played such a central role, I think is ultimately, first not going to happen, but very much we could find ourselves in a very uncomfortable position, a couple of years from now when everybody is still disillusioned about why things didn't change despite having these, transformative renegotiations of trade agreements.
Yeah, so I agree very much with what Todd said about these are really trade agreements today aren't really so much about trade, but they've really grown and they're more about a broad array of economic cooperation issues. And so I think there are two issues. One is sort of where you draw the line in regulating things through trade agreements versus other cooperation mechanisms. And the more you draw the line in an encompassing way, bringing in more and more issues like climate change that have much bigger than trade domestic implications, then the more you need to change the process. The more open it has to be, the more it has to be inclusive, the more I would think the more you start to bring in a lot of other issues beyond fairly narrow trade issues, things like what's called the fast track mechanism for ratifying trade agreements, which isn't actually all that fast.
No.
But it does require an up or down vote by Congress. Well, I think that the less legitimate those kinds of mechanisms for passing trade agreements are. So I think there are the two issues. So where do you draw the line, and then from that, what's the process? And just on drawing the line, I do think there's a concern that bringing a lot of things into a trade agreement that are really about domestic regulatory policy, and even clearly climate change needs international cooperation, and they've tried that in Paris and are continuing to work at it. But I think that sticking it into a trade agreement doesn't help us solve the problems. It doesn't help us get the cooperation that we need. So while there may be some trade-related climate issues that we should be addressing in trade agreements, I don't think we can solve the entire climate change problem. Similarly, with labor, I don't think that you should be using trade agreements to determine all of a partner country's labor laws and institutions and mechanisms for addressing labor standards. If there are products coming in under a trade agreement that were made with forced labor or child labor, or where a union was repressed, you may want to take action against those imports. But having a very broad chapter on labor that is basically setting, this influencing all of labor law, whether in their country or ours, I don't think is going to be legitimate or effective. And that's on so that's what some people have proposed as the balancing of what are viewed as overly corporate-friendly trade agreements, is to bring in these other issues. I would say, why don't we just pare back and actually talk about trade and trade agreements? And so does intellectual property broadly, just as with labor, broadly defined to all of your, what's your patent system going to be belong in a trade agreement? I would argue no. Again, if there are trade-related things, if there are counterfeit products that are violating a trademark coming in, you should be able to act against those trademarks. So I think the where to draw the line, I would, just to what my paper that Erin mentioned is, let's maybe really think new and take out the intellectual property chapter, take out ISDS, take out labor and environment, and deal with those things where they affect trade more directly in a direct way, and then look for what are the other tools where we can address those in a cooperative manner, but where you have actually climate experts. Do we want the U.S. Trade Representative, because that's who negotiates trade agreements, do we want them negotiating what our climate strategy should be? So I take a fairly different approach from most folks and say, let's make trade agreements about trade. Definitely, deal with these issues where we need to in the context of trade, but then look to other cooperative arrangements to actually, I think it would be more effective to deal with labor and environment and climate change where you have labor and environment and climate change experts being the ones who are engaging and cooperating.
Great. Well, Todd, I'm going to turn to you next, but Chad and Kim, you should feel free to weigh in on this too. This is sort of all related. We're going to go a little bit more into this kind of developing country side of things. So last month it was reported that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi spoke with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on the status of the USMCA and emphasized kind of lingering concerns, particularly around the implementation of labor standards. And she said yesterday that Democrats were, quote, making progress, but it seems like they aren't quite there yet. Since being included as a part of a side agreement with NAFTA, the original NAFTA, labor provisions and their enforcement have really, risen to a very central role in U.S. free trade agreements and their negotiations. So I'm curious, what you think in terms of, maybe there's a role for this overselling USMCA, but how can the U.S. ensure that legitimate concerns about labor rights are resolved in a way that doesn't disadvantage developing countries? Or, is there some merit to Kim's argument that we should strip them out entirely?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Like, you look at sort of the volume of investment disputes, and it's now in the hundreds. Nearly 1,000. The labor trade agreement dispute, we've had one, a significant one, a number of years ago, and it was brought by the Obama administration under CAFTA and the Central America Free Trade Agreement. And the hurdle that they ran into is it's just really difficult to prove a sort of trade connection to a discrete instance of labor rights violations. So that's something that's been really tough. And one of the things that unions have been calling for is to strip that requirement, that it be trade linked, the specific violation be narrowly trade linked. But then you run into kind of the concern that Kim brings up, which is that, so is that just carte blanche to sort of go after country sovereignty and sort of their own domestic decision making on labor policy? So there's a lot of things to balance. One of the things that I've put forward is what I call worker power agreement, or WPA, and this could be attached to a trade agreement. It could be sort of its own thing, but basically it would take sort of the template of the Paris Climate Accords, which has this really nice feature of being both binding commitments to reduce carbon emissions and also allowing countries the leeway to decide how they're going to get there in a locally appropriate way. So it kind of takes that and applies it to labor. So instead of saying we're going to have a 5% reduction in carbon emissions, let's have a 5% increase in union density, or these other objective metrics of labor power. And there's a lot of research that shows sort of union density really helps, higher union density really helps explain sort of lower rates of inequality as well. But then allowing countries to figure out how they're going to get there. Like you take the target, we're going to hold each other to it, but you can kind of do it in a locally appropriate way, whether that's through privileging unions in the procurement process, whether that's sort of the Ghent system that they've used in Belgium and other countries, which is you allow unions to disperse unemployment benefits or other types of benefits, so that then there's an incentive for workers to join. There's a lot of different ways that you could get there, and each country could kind of decide. But it would just be sort of both a symbolic way of sort of underlying the importance of solid labor market institutions in a time of sky-high inequality, and then also providing some ways to actually get there.
Yeah, great. Do you want to add anything? Okay. Chad, I'm going to direct this one to you next. So Kim referred to the Generalized System of Preferences, or GSP, a program adopted by industrialized countries, including the U.S., to help developing countries increase exports and ideally promote economic growth and development. Earlier this year, the Trump administration withdrew GSP benefits from both Turkey and India. And the entire U.S. program will expire at the end of next year, as it's long been extended in 2 or 3 year increments. So I'd be interested in hearing whether you think the administration's decisions with respect to Turkey and India were justified, and then whether, more broadly, you would recommend Congress pursue reforms to GSP when it considers authorizing an extension of the program next year.
So, the decisions that they made on India and Turkey, kind of the legal criteria that they use to justify, I don't think I necessarily agree with. I think there's arguments to be made for, perhaps not having them in GSP or having GSP structured differently. So maybe I'll focus on that aspect of it. So I think GSP is one of these extraordinarily well-intentioned programs. But as Kim indicated, the actual implementation of it is horrible. It's not actually a development program, right? And so, despite its name and its sort of desire, the first thing that's the most important thing is the products that poor countries would want to export to the United States. It's the United States and other countries that have these types of programs get to decide whether or not they're on the list of giving the lower tariffs to. And the most important products are not on the list. So clothing, apparel, textiles, footwear, agriculture are all, for the most part, not given these tariff preferences. And that is what a lot of lower skilled developing countries want to be able to sell, want to be able to export, have a comparative advantage in exporting. So the program on the United States' side is just not designed to do or to maximize essentially the benefits to poor countries. There's other specific elements to it. The fact that it's up for renewal, too frequently. It has other elements like, continual product reviews, country reviews. Just generates a tremendous amount of uncertainty that even for products for which the tariff preference exists, whether or not it's actually going to be there a year from now or 2 years from now. And in a lot of these instances, this is extraordinarily important because these are products that, if you want to be able to take advantage of them, they require investment. They require companies to be able to come in and to make big investments that are going to pay off after a number of years, which means that you need to ensure access to the United States market, not only at this moment in time, but 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now. And the program is just not designed to be able to provide that level of uncertainty. And with that, the investment then doesn't come, and the point of the program is never really realized. So there's some, I think, pretty serious fundamental flaws with the way that the American GSP program is designed that kind of we're just now beginning to understand, or at least have evidence of this through economics research to be able to pinpoint this. In other countries, they seem to be doing better. So the EU undertook a major revision of its preference programs a couple of years ago. First off, by doing a major systematic study of what elements, what parts of their programs worked and what didn't, and then revising and reforming their programs to take advantage or to reflect that information. But a big part of it, I think, was this question of uncertainty. And so their programs are now much longer lived. Yes, they still have basically tied elements to them that, for certain programs, you have to satisfy a variety of commitments on labor standards, environmental standards, human rights, sustainable development, and those types of elements. But the program is there, provided you meet these standards for now much longer periods of time. And so if you are, seeking to attract investment necessary to be able to take advantage of the program, there's greater certainty there. And so I think that there are ways in which the United States could learn from what it is other countries have done that's been more successful. Certainly, the Trump administration, by taking pretty serious steps, pulling Turkey out of GSP, pulling India out of GSP. There may be other countries that face a similar fate. This could be a moment if not this year, perhaps next year, the year after, to do a serious rethink about what the American preference program for poor countries might look like, in which case we actually want to think hard about what a redesign of this program might actually be.
I'd just say one word about AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which does include, it at least includes clothing, it includes most of the manufacturing. It still has some exclusions for some key agricultural goods, but I mean, it is better. The problem there, and they did actually the last time around extend it for 10 years, yeah. So that was all good. The problem is, that we're about halfway through that 10-year period, and a lot of folks in the administration and Congress have been saying that they don't anticipate renewing AGOA again when it expires in 2025, but without really saying, well, what's going to replace it or what's going to be there for Africa afterwards. They've talked about doing bilateral, some sort of reciprocal trade agreements, sort of like Europe has done with their economic partnership agreements in Africa, which have actually, that's one element of European trade and development strategy that has been widely criticized as really being ineffective and as undermining regional integration in Africa. And the Trump administration has been talking about maybe doing a bilateral with one country in Africa. So that lack of a plan, there again, and AGOA, expiring in a few years is creating a lot of uncertainty there, without any real clear plans as to what comes next. So I think as part of this big rethink that I agree is very much overdue, that is an element of the thinking that should definitely be a part of it.
Great. Kim? So last week, the Trump administration announced that it had reached the first stage of a trade agreement with Japan. And I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about what you think the broader implications of that deal are, but beyond the U.S. and Japan, and obviously with a particular eye towards developing countries.
Yeah, so the U.S. and Japan last week did a mini deal that covers only some agricultural liberalization in Japan and some liberalization of relatively low, less than 5% industrial tariffs in the US. Does not include autos at all, which is Japan's major export. Doesn't include all of the other elements of whatever you think about the elements of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, to which the Obama administration had signed on along with Japan and 10 other Pacific countries. So it's a really mini deal, and here's why I think that's actually a big deal. It's because as a mini deal, it is clearly in violation of World Trade Organization rules regarding bilateral and regional free trade agreements. The system is supposed to be multilateral, but it does allow for a few exceptions. One of them is for bilateral free trade agreements, but in order to be consistent with the rules and to be as least distorting of other countries' trade as possible, these free trade agreements are supposed to cover substantially all trade. And that's never been defined by the WTO, but I think it's pretty clear that the US-Japan deal does not cover substantially all trade. So it's yet another example where, the US is doing something that is, it probably will never be found formally in violation of WTO rules because they've never ruled on any free trade agreement, but it clearly is in violation with, I would argue, the letter as well as the spirit of the organization. Now, that's not so shocking. The Trump administration has taken a lot of actions that have violated the rules. What's concerning is the fact that Japan was bullied into signing on to this agreement, because Japan has been one of the foremost supporters of the multilateral trade system and one of the sticklers of saying that any agreement it signs should be consistent with that Article 24, those constraints. They're trying to kind of cover that over by saying this is an interim agreement and that they plan to start agreements in other areas, including automobiles, sometime next year. But I think it's pretty obvious that is just a cover story. And so losing Japan as a key supporter, and it's sort of an example of the Trump trade virus is not going to just be contained here. It is going to have some global spillovers. Again, Japan in another area had a dispute with South Korea. And Chad, I don't know if you want to say anything more. You did an excellent podcast on the Japan-South Korea dispute, which I highly recommend, but where Japan used the national security rationale to restrict some trade with South Korea, and it was really about other issues. And so that the erosion of norms and of the rules, and especially having Japan, which has been one of the foremost supporters of the multilateral system, I find to be, even though it's a mini deal, to be really concerning. And again, given that developing countries are the biggest beneficiaries of a rules-based system, I think for CGD, that is a big concern.
I'll just quickly reiterate that point. In the United States, we've never done mini deals. These things happen in other countries out there in the world. The United States has been, a leader in saying if you're going to do a trade agreement with somebody, you're going to go all the way and basically cover everything, with the exception of, sugar and stuff. But this is clearly a deviation from that. And what this does is it sends a signal to everybody else in the world that you can now do the same thing as well, right? And this erodes another principle. And yes, so the other, Japan had been showing tremendous leadership in America's absence over the last couple of years, except now with this thing with South Korea, right? And so now it's sort of everybody for themselves. That's how I interpreted Japan's willingness to accept this deal with the Trump administration, is they realized this threat that they were facing of auto tariffs is a really big deal for Japan, right? This is a massive part of their economy. It's a huge part of their exports to the United States. And the Trump administration, was holding that over their head. They felt like they had to do this deal because they were worried about that. And so now we're in this world where it's everyone for themselves. We're all economic nationalists in some sense, right? And so you do lose another leader out there in the system, and then you not only lose that, but then they start bullying their neighbor on issues. This thing with South Korea on export controls. And again, this is a long-standing dispute between South Korea and Japan, and doesn't really have much to do with trade, but it has to do with, with atrocities dating back a century. But now, how do we get our way out of these things, right? When we're sort of losing the historical means of being able to manage these frictions and to keep them contained, and be able to maintain cooperation in other areas. I fear this is just
another step toward
spiraling a little bit out of control. I thought we were going to keep this positive.
All right, well, yeah, so I've got one last question, and I hope everyone will jump in on this. But given the erosion you both cited, what do you think are the prospects for salvaging the rules-based system and reviving the World Trade Organization? We can try to be a little more positive.
End on a positive.
Yeah, hopefully.
Well, I think, as both Chad and Kim have pointed out, I mean, there's the increasing use of this national security exception really opens up a big hole in the rules-based order that, it's hard to know if we're gonna be able to recover from that, right? Another thing is the sort of increasing politicization of the dispute settlement process at the WTO, which actually started under Obama and was continued, even more forcefully under Trump, and we're now down to one WTO appellate body judge, and that person's term is up later this year. So at that point, we're really in sort of unknown territory as to how the institution will work. So given that things seem so sort of fundamentally broken, I've been asking myself whether this is an opportunity to sort of do big change of the organization. Certainly the Canadians and the Europeans, there's different proposals out there to think about, sort of more incremental proposals than what I'm about to say, to sort of rebuild the institution. But if we've got all these vacancies, let's fill up the appellate body with a bunch of environmental lawyers and labor rights lawyers, and actually create an alliance between libertarians and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, have the WTO enforce the Green New Deal on a global level. Let's do it. Who's with me? That's my hope.
So I'm still, sticking with being a multilateralist and thinking that we have to find a way, and hopefully we'll find a way to salvage the multilateral trade system. It obviously requires a change in U.S. leadership that is willing to embrace multilateralism rather than unilateralism. I don't necessarily expect whoever may be the next president, whoever it is, to take a leading role on that, but they have to be supportive. I think the real change comes if developing countries do realize their interest in the multilateral system, and they step forward, along with some of the richer but small open economies, in Canada and the European Union, but has also been working on some of these reform proposals. But anyway, the smaller, more open and developing countries to get together and try and really start to work on rebuilding the multilateral system. And there are a lot of pieces to that, which we can't all deal with. I mean, Todd mentioned the appellate body under the dispute settlement system, which is close to cratering, which means the rules can't be enforced. Negotiations have been stop and start and pretty minimal since around 2008, when the last big multilateral round collapsed. So I think there needs to be, I think where sort of since the Doha round, which was that last big multilateral round, sort of ground to a halt in the late 2000s, there has been success in taking things at the WTO sort of incrementally, taking smaller steps. They tried to do this great big round that addressed everything in trade, and it was just too much to swallow, I think. And it followed on the Uruguay round in the 90s, which again was this what they called a single undertaking. You have to sign on to everything, and that created a lot of bad will. So I think maybe turning back to an incremental approach in terms of reforming. Clearly, we have to fix the dispute settlement body, and there are lots of good ideas on how to do that I won't get into. There needs to be some institutional reforms in terms of the Secretariat to make things a little smoother functioning, but the core of the trade system has always been multilateral negotiations. And now a lot of people are saying, well, we're having the Doha round failed, maybe what we need to do is together subgroups of like-minded countries, and they can negotiate plurilateral agreements and move forward in that way. And that could work in some areas. But I think, again, that's still sort of eroding the multilateral system. And so I'd like to see a negotiation, and I'm working on a paper now that I hope will be out by the end of the year, sort of a back to basics, what I call confidence building negotiation. Let's just get back to, okay, it's trade and tariffs, and see if we can do it in a way that everybody contributes. So developing countries in this context of a relatively narrow, and I won't go into the details because they're fairly technical of the specific things I'm proposing, but they're mainly tariff related, and they're about increasing transparency and predictability in trade and reinforcing the non-discrimination principle. So that means that I think for this to work, developing countries really do have to step up, and they have to be willing to contribute along with everybody else. And that means not asking for special and differential treatment, which has become a big problem separate from where we are now with the populist backlash. That's been a long-standing problem of how do you treat developing countries in the WTO, especially with China emerging as a major trading nation, yet still being defined for WTO purposes as a developing country. So they need to start working through. Those are some very difficult issues, but I think I would hope that kind of if we could agree on sort of a mini deal, it's an incremental step. But if it's also relatively low cost to do things like bind all of your tariffs or get rid of tariffs that are so-called nuisance tariffs below 2% that cost more to collect than they actually generate in revenue, some sort of simple transparency, accountability, things like that, then maybe that starts to rebuild confidence in that the WTO actually can operate and move on to some bigger and more ambitious areas. So that's my sort of mini vision for a multilateral deal.
So 2 quick points to leave you with optimism. The first, if you check Twitter, don't, sorry. But if you were to check Twitter, President Trump actually tweeted something nice about the WTO this morning. Of course, it was the United States winning the Airbus subsidy dispute, and he claimed credit for it. But it was I was shocked. I just didn't on Twitter. I didn't know how to respond, and that's rare for me. But that was a positive thing, right? So I'm going to take something positive away from that. The second thing I can say positively about the Trump administration is they have engaged the world on a lot of the challenges and problems and need for change and shortcomings of the international system. So the rest of the world, I think, is now ready to do stuff in ways that they haven't been willing to before, where they were dragging their feet before when prior administrations may have been pushing on different agendas. So I think there's, I have yet to see what this administration's vision for taking advantage of that would be, reinvigorating multilateralism. They may not have one, but if there is a different administration at some point in the future, there is going to be an opportunity there for change. Maybe it is an appellate body filled with environmental and labor judges. It could be a whole lot of different things, but I think there's going to be an opportunity there to make a big difference, and we can thank the Trump administration for creating that opportunity for us. So with that, I'm optimistic.
All right, well, we're going to open it up to the audience now. It's a good opening for questions, I'm sure. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and we've got mics in the back. So I just ask that you wait till a mic comes to you and introduce yourself before you ask. We'll go here, there. Well, yeah, here. We'll do 2 at a time here. The woman right here, and then this gentleman over on this side. There, she's good. Yeah, perfect.
Hi, Emmy Simmons, CSIS advisor. You mentioned, I think, Chad, at the beginning, the sort of impact of tariffs on steel producers in the U.S. And you, Kim, mentioned that everybody now understands that the impact of the increased tariffs is on consumers. But I haven't heard you talk very much about sorting out the impact on American jobs. And given that those are kind of slipping these days, how do you see the sort of domestic impact of tariffs on employment in the U.S.?
Yeah. So, what we can say on the economic side of this is on net, we think that trade really doesn't have an impact on the level of jobs, the total number of jobs. What it does is it has an impact on the distribution of jobs. And so there, I think what the ultimate impact of President Trump's trade policy is, we'll have to wait and see until the whole thing plays out. But that's what it's going to be. If you're in a sector that's now protected because of all of these tariffs, and you have a job in that sector, you're going to benefit from that because you don't face competition from outside. If you're in a sector that was relying on those imports, you're going to be worse off because of that. So your pay might be lower, but I think, on net, the number of jobs won't necessarily change. It's just going to be the distribution of who's working where, maybe how much they're being paid. Inequality may be affected one way or the other by this. I think we'll have to wait and see how it plays out. But on the level of jobs, we're at 3.7% unemployment, and that's, here nor there with all the tariffs.
I want to just piggyback on that. One of the telling things was in the steel sector, after the tariffs went up, it ended up that the company CEOs were taking all of the rents from that and weren't trickling it down to their workforce. So the steel workers were actually going on strike to try to claim some share of that rent. And I think this case just kind of illustrates how tariffs are a very indirect and inefficient way of accomplishing other social policy objectives.
And just one addition on that is that those are sort of the direct effects, and I agree with that. I think what we're seeing, though, there are big indirect effects in terms of the uncertainty and the impact on investors not wanting to invest, not wanting to hire more. We're at full employment, so maybe they wouldn't anyway. But so I think we're starting to see that uncertainty potentially having broader economic effects. So it's not the direct effect of tariffs, but just the sort of overall environment and the conflict and the uncertainty it's creating could be having some negative effects on the economy as a whole.
Hi, Bryce Senna with SW4 Insights. I would like to get the panel's reaction to the WTO's decision this week around the EU subsidies for Airbus. Specifically, how now the US has permission beyond just putting higher tariffs on EU exports of aircraft, but other goods as well from the EU. And then more broadly, the conversation has always been tariffs are bad, they're not the way to address issues with trade and imbalances, et cetera, except now the US is giving permission to impose tariffs. So it's so people who don't follow this as closely are now wondering, well, you said tariffs are bad, but now you're saying in this situation they're okay. So how do you square all that with someone who doesn't follow these issues as closely on an everyday basis?
So it's a great question, and it's a really challenging one to explain. So I'd invite you to listen to the next episode of Trade Talks, and it'll take me 20 minutes to explain it. So basically, you're exactly right? So this is how the WTO system works. Is it basically says if you're going to do something and you're going to break the rules, the only way that we have to sanction that is to take something away from you, and the only thing that we have to take away from you is your access to our market through tariffs. And so that's the only sanctioning ability that we have in the WTO. We can't throw countries in jail. We can't fine them. I guess we can throw their CEOs' daughters in jail, maybe something like that. But for the most part, all we have are tariffs, right? But there's a legal process to set that up, and it's an impartial body that determines what the levels of those tariffs would be. So it's $7.5 billion. It wasn't the Trump administration that got to decide that. That was the WTO making a decision about sort of the harm that arose from the European tariffs. Now, the bigger point of all of this dispute, though, of course, is just as Airbus gets subsidies in Europe, so does Boeing in the United States. And so there's a parallel dispute happening. It's not quite parallel. It's 8 months behind, in which case Europeans are going to be authorized to retaliate against the United States exports for the subsidies that we haven't gotten rid of in a dispute that we've lost. And so the question will be at that stage is, do both countries simply impose tariffs on each other? So you both are doing the bad subsidies and you're now both compounding the problem by imposing tariffs against each other? Or do you sit down and negotiate a deal where you say, okay, we'll both stop doing the subsidies that are a violation of the rules and neither of us will do the tariffs on each other? So where we are right now is just sort of at an intermediate point that's arisen because of a little bit of the asynchronicity of the two disputes. The American dispute is a little bit further advanced than the European dispute. And so 8 months from now, we'll be at the stage where we're both there at the same time, and we'll see what happens then.
I would maybe just add, if I could, a little bit, because we maybe for some in the audience glossed over the national security cases a little bit. So what Todd is emphasizing is that it's maybe not optimal, but the way the system is set up is that you can be authorized to impose tariffs by going through this WTO dispute settlement system. The way the Trump administration has tried to sort of self-authorize or to rationalize a lot of the tariffs that it has been imposing is by saying that it's a national security issue to have a steel industry, or potentially in the future an automobile industry, which is a real stretch. And why that's so dangerous, there is a national security exception in the WTO rules where you can take actions against imports for national security reasons. And the Trump administration has tried to claim that they were the sole arbiter of what constituted a national security threat, and therefore could impose these tariffs, those tariffs on steel and aluminum. It was not even subject to review by the WTO. And so that's why it's potentially such a big loophole, because that means any country could just claim national security for anything. Now, the WTO did, in a case involving Russia and Ukraine, did rule on that claim and said, no, it's not completely unconstrained. It is reviewable by dispute panels. And in that particular case, they authorized the Russians to take the action they had against Ukrainian imports, but said, but here are some of the conditions that you have to meet in order to be able to do that. So there are these situations where tariffs can be done legally under the WTO, but that set of national security cases, that's a really dangerous potential precedent, and one that puts a lot of, because clearly countries do want to be able to have the flexibility to protect their national security, right? And so it's a very tricky balance for the WTO to have to rule in those cases. But at least they now have said this is not, in fact, as Trump has claimed, something where he can just do it completely unilaterally as long as he hangs a national security label on it.
And there's a domestic corollary to that as well, which is an inter-branch fight between Congress and the executive branch, where just as there's kind of this vaguely open-ended provisions from trade law, international trade law, our domestic trade law also has sort of a similar kind of vague and imprecise provision. So there's kind of been this inter-branch fight, and there's actually a case brought by steel importers over the national security tariffs that's working its way through the court system now to see just how much discretion the president has. But as it's written, it's pretty broad discretion. It's self-defining what constitutes a national emergency, and self-defining what tools you're going to use to address it. So it is, we have, this is part of a larger pattern in U.S. law over the last several decades of increasing power in the executive branch and less power in Congress.
Barbara Stallings, Brown University, among other places. I am intrigued but skeptical by two of Kim's ideas. I hope we can follow up a bit, at least on one of them. So the first one is the narrow trade deals, stripping out labor, environment, IP, etc. Isn't that going to sort of cut back on a lot of whatever support there is for trade agreements? If you say that the things you're most interested in we're not going to incorporate, why bother to support them? Second, the LDC leadership for trying to make things better. I have never understood why so many developing countries are against the WTO. So we have to figure out sort of why that is, and then what can be done to turn that around, to convince them that, seems to me, is true what you said at the very beginning. If they don't have a rules-based system, then they're just at the mercy of the Trumps and others in the world. But how can we do that?
So I think it's a good point on the narrow FTAs, and it to be perfectly frank, probably isn't politically feasible. I think as I say, what I'm suggesting is not entirely taking all of those things out, but narrowing down the scope of what would be addressable, on labor or environment or IP. So I think on something like ISDS, I think Todd's idea of expanding investor-state dispute settlement to also allow workers or citizens to challenge corporations over their labor or environmental practices is a good one. But if the business community is confronted with that kind of expansion versus just get rid of investor-state dispute settlement from trade agreements, because it's being pared back anyway, which would they choose? And my guess is they might go with it, just getting rid of it, rather than expanding it. So I think, I think the question is more on the business side. How much paring back do you get before the business says these trade agreements aren't worth it anymore? But to be blunt, in my view, there is virtually no labor chapter that is ever going to get the AFL to endorse a trade agreement. So I don't think you're buying. It gives some cover to a handful of Democrats in Congress who want to vote for trade agreements but need some cover. I'd rather find different cover. Because mainly my main objection is I don't think it's an effective way. I am all in favor of raising labor standards in developing countries. I just don't think it's effective precisely because it gets put in there and then it gets ignored. And it actually, as Todd was saying, there's only been one case. So I don't think it's actually an effective way of promoting that agenda. So I'd rather focus on ways how can we really make a difference on labor and just narrow back the trade. Is it politically viable? Probably not, but I don't see that the current template is going to be sustainable either. So in sort of the spirit of big thinking, on your second question on the developing countries, I think it's a good question. I don't think all developing countries are opposed to the WTO, and I think what is potentially different. Sort of up to now, special and differential treatment for developing countries has been the operational standard, and they have been mostly able to free ride on the system. I think the question is, do they see the threat now of the system eroding to irrelevance potentially? Is that threat big enough to get a change in behavior where they're willing to contribute something? And again, I'm not, suggesting getting rid of special and differential treatment entirely, but I think it needs to be rethought going forward. And then in this particular case of this confidence-building negotiation, to really have it be very much minimized, just to show that the developing countries do value the organization and are willing to do something. As I say, and I think. It's again unclear whether that will happen. I think it depends on the degree to which it really is a test of whether they value it or not. And it may turn out that they don't, or not enough of them do anyway.
So hopefully we can have a panel on Kim's paper.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Amaka. I run the Africa practice at Eurasia Group. I have a question. I have two questions for Kim. But I just want to say that I am a big fan of Chad's Trade Talks podcast, and everybody should listen to it. So you started your comments saying that the current trading system discriminates against the poor, but within the US and globally, which I find very fascinating. And obviously I can think of some political reasons for the protection for agricultural products and stuff, big political constituency and all that stuff. But I would love to hear your thoughts more on why this persists and continues to be the case, and if there's an outlook for any change in. And I was looking quickly at this paper, and I also saw your argument that even within those highly protected categories, the tariffs often target the least expensive products, which I find fascinating. I'd love to hear a little bit more about why this is the case and your outlook for if this can ever change, really. Thank you.
So I didn't mean to suggest that it was in any way intentional, that the U.S. government was somehow setting out to discriminate against poor people. It basically has to do with those are the products. As you mentioned, agriculture is kind of, I think a lot of us, agriculture is just different. And it's different in most countries, right, around the world. And most other countries do have sort of similar patterns, but agriculture gets lots of support, lots of protection. Long story on sort of how that all came about. But I think that's, on the other side, it's that the apparel and the footwear, those are, because they are where other countries would tend to have more of a comparative advantage, there's been more import pressure. And so you get pressure from the domestic industry to slow those imports to preserve the industry in this country. The paradox is despite actually having relatively high tariffs, it's well over 90% of clothing and footwear are imported. So we're paying those taxes for really no reason at all. They are not saving jobs. They're not saving companies in the United States. So I think at this point it's a combination of inertia and the other reason I should say is going back to this notion of special and differential treatment that developing countries are so eager to embrace in the multilateral system was also a factor, because they were, in essence, what happened was the rich countries would negotiate. This is going back now, in the early days of when tariffs were the main issue in trade negotiations, actually. They would negotiate the deal and then apply it across all members of what was then the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Developing countries could basically free ride on the system. So they weren't asked to contribute any to the tariff cuts. The developed countries would negotiate them among themselves, but then apply them to everyone. But that also meant that if the developing countries weren't participating in the negotiations, they couldn't put forward their own interests and priorities in those negotiations. So it kind of, because they weren't participating in the negotiations, they were just free riding, then we sort of are then left with this structure where the rich countries addressed their import competing industry concerns, and developing countries didn't really have much of a say in things. And that's one of the then, rich countries tend not to unilaterally reduce their tariffs, except in free trade agreements or through preference programs. And there they've been, again, mostly excluded. So again, revive the multilateral system and focus on tariffs, and let's just get rid of all these pesky things.
Can I just add one thing, though, and this came up before, which is the way you reduce those, though, I think to really hammer on Kim's point, is you engage poor countries to reciprocally bargain, right? This is clearly in their interest. The fact that there's still really high tariffs on the stuff that they want to export, right? How it is that you get those tariffs down, you get those countries to come to the negotiating table and negotiate for them. Now, they may have to be willing to give up something themselves. Kim has a proposal that they should just be willing to bind their existing tariffs where they are, which they haven't done yet. That may be something, a step in the right direction. But this is the reciprocal way. To the extent that the system before the WTO and the WTO have been successful, it's really through this reciprocal, I will lower something tariffs for you and you lower something tariffs for me. That's what's engaged the market opening. And where poor countries haven't been able to benefit from that, that's because they've been absent from the reciprocal part of that entire process. And so I think one way to interpret your proposal is engaging the reciprocal nature of the negotiations again and trying to figure out how to get poorer developing countries to buy into that framework, which the special and differential treatment framework has not allowed them to be.
All right, so we're going to take two this time because I think we've got a couple people. So we've got two folks with microphones here, and then if we have time, we'll try to get over there too.
And if I ask two questions, does that preempt other people?
I'll just ask them quickly.
My name is Richard Newfarmer. I'm with the International Growth Center. Just one question I have is whether or not the political economy of trade policy is actually changing in the United States as a consequence of the Trump policies. So, for example, what are the positions of the steel companies that are benefiting from the tariffs, and are they becoming stronger in terms of their advocacy in the halls of policymaking for the maintenance of those tariffs? And are we likely to see, as a consequence, an erosion of whatever support there was for the exporters in the process? Now, we know the farmers on the other side. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about the permanence of this, because I think it influences a lot how we think about the future. The second question is, I'm wondering if we should just not talk about trade agreements at all. I mean, one takeaway from this panel is, to the extent we have trade agreements, fine, strip away all the other nonsense, because we've misidentified the problem and we've misidentified as a consequence the solution. And it's not clear to me that in the context of the current political discussion in the United States that we can really talk about trade policy and trade agreements. I like the idea of thinking about using the topics of multilateral trade reform and reforming the WTO, because I think that could resonate. But let's talk about development policy writ large. Let's talk about helping poor people, and therefore going to the discussion of perhaps aid for trade, trade facilitation might be a better window. Or on the question of labor, let's talk about, Andrew Yang is getting a lot of mileage on his discussions about technology. I mean, technology is a big factor here, and it's likely to be an important driver into the future. Maybe we should begin to think about portable healthcare, portable adjustment in the U.S. market as being the window of the policies that we change. So those are my questions. Maybe that's a question and a comment. Sorry.
Why don't you go ahead and ask yours, and then we get one mic over there, and we'll just try to do the last three in rapid succession. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Hello, my name is Madeline Hauenstein, and I'm with the Africa Bureau at the United States Agency for International Development, so you can see where this is going. So you briefly mentioned the impacts of AGOA as a trade initiative, and it's also a developmental tool, is how it's been framed, particularly at USAID. And you also mentioned the new increasing two-way trade initiative, Prosper Africa. So my question goes into, what do you think the impact is on trade as a development tool when shifting from an AGOA export to the U.S. strategy to a bilateral investment and trade strategy such as Prosper Africa? And do you think it's time for a paradigm shift?
All right, now let's get the third one over here. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Okay, hello. So I am Bara Hanzalova. I am an international trade and economic diplomacy student of the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. And I would like to ask about the role of the private sector in negotiating the lowerings of US tariffs and its impact on international development. So do you see that with the current global value chain revolution, the US MNCs would be able to successfully lobby the US government for lowering the tariffs on products that have been previously protected by the industrial policies that these firms perhaps themselves advanced, such as the lowering tariffs on agriculture that would be possible through the lowered costs of production in developing countries. Then related to that, I would like to ask if on the developing country side, if the MNC's perhaps advancement of policy would hurt the development prospects of these countries, even though the growth could be facilitated by the increased competitiveness of the United States as those who would manage the global value chains, keeping themselves on the top. Thank you.
All right, feel free to jump in on any of those.
Well, I'll start on the question about sort of the political economy and is it changing. I mean, I think you've kind of got to separate steel from almost every other industry. USTR Lighthizer, the ambassador in charge there, comes from the steel sector, has deep connections in the steel sector, and yeah, that industry has a lot of access. Is it really changing the political economy of trade? Not too much, because there's just not that many steel workers in the country, and for the most part, their leadership is not going to encourage them to vote Republican, right? So it's not really changing the political economy that much. And you look at something like the auto sector, right, where he's launched this national security investigation. For the most part, neither the union or the companies really want this kind of protection. He's doing it kind of out on his own. So it's sort of an executive branch unilateral thing more than it is reflective of some sort of underlying shift in the politics. On this sort of recurring question of like simple trade agreements or complex trade agreements, I mean, I tend to be more on the side of complexity, in part just because, in order to get these things through, you have to build a coalition. And, in the 80s, when sort of trade liberalization was stalling, the Reagan administration and Democrats in Congress got together and said, hey, let's create fast track mandates to have financial services rules and IP rules and all these other things so that we can get more of K Street excited about actually pushing through this kind of legislation. So to me, I think that's the why the complexity is there. And it would just be interesting to think through if that complexity could benefit sort of a wider array of interest in the future. So that's kind of the spirit of a lot of the proposals I've thrown out there.
I'll just say one thing on the domestic politics as well. You know, my understanding of looking at the polling on trade and trying to make sense of it is that we seem to now be at sort of a moment of disconnect between the political leadership of both parties and who it is that votes for them. With the exception of, you know, sort of President Trump, the rest of the Republican leadership in the House and Senate and a lot of their members are still relatively free trade oriented, and yet the voters seem to not be. And it's just the opposite on the Democratic side. The Democratic side seems to be more pro kind of globalization, immigration, and yet some of the candidates and leaders in Congress are very protectionist. So there is this kind of weird disconnect between the voters and who their elected representatives are in some sense. And so how that shakes out, I'm not sure. But it does seem to be where it's kind of a weird moment in terms of, you know, where the voting public is and where the politicians actually are on a lot of these issues.
Kim, do you want to say something about the AGOA?
Yeah, let me take the AGOA question. I think the problem is you have something like 2/3 or more of the least developed countries in the world by, you know, the UN designated LDCs are in Africa, and most of the other countries in Africa are low middle income. So we're talking about, you know, mostly very poor, you know, underdeveloped economies that I think really are just not in a position to do fully reciprocal trade agreements of the U.S. style. I mean, one of the reasons that the U.S. has, say, a much smaller number of free trade agreements than the EU does is that it has this template that has not only the tariff cuts, but the intellectual property and the labor standards and financial services and a lot of stuff that a lot of African countries just aren't ready to take on yet. So I just don't see in practical terms how, unless the U.S. is willing to be a little more flexible with its template, that you can do, that the reciprocal free trade agreements, especially on a bilateral basis, could replace AGOA. And the second thing is this issue of regional integration. I forget some of Nancy Birdsall used to have these wonderful metaphors about how, like, the entire country of Kenya's economy is smaller than, you know, I don't know, the city of Chicago or something like that. But I mean, these are really small economies that, you know, individually, one by one, simply, you know, really can't get the economies of scale they need to be competitive in international markets. And so regional integration, trying to break down internal barriers so that they can kind of create a bigger unit among themselves that can then engage, you know, on with the rest of the world, I think is a really essential for Africa. And so doing bilateral deals just undercuts that goal of trying to get to regional integration in Africa. So I think it's a really bad, and that's where the European EPAs have really run into trouble. So, you know, with some flexibility, maybe there's a way there, but I think this idea of doing it in a way that supports regional integration should really be at the sort of the top of the thinking in terms of what comes after AGOA.
And then we had one about sort of the private sector negotiating with policymakers, and I think the for or against their success in protected sectors or reducing protections.
Yeah, I don't have much to say, sorry. I mean, it is definitely true that when you look at and this kind of reiterates Kim's point, when you look at the structure of protection that's out there, of tariffs, that, and this is, you know, arguably the interest of the big multinational companies, the tariffs that are on intermediate inputs, the stuff that they need to buy to be able to make stuff, are extraordinarily low, right? It's the final good tariffs, clothing, shoes, you know, that kind of stuff that are very, very high. so they are effective in general at getting lower tariffs where they want, at least before the Trump administration came along, right? So what we're seeing that's very different with this administration is they're raising tariffs on all the intermediate stuff, whether it's steel, aluminum, or all the stuff that's from China, and it's not until the very end, these next rounds, that we're seeing tariff increases on all the final consumer goods.
Right.
And I guess the last thing on that, you mentioned supply chains, and I think that's where a lot of the pressure for more behind the border, bringing more behind the border and regulatory issues into trade agreements is coming from multinationals at the head of these supply chains, where because tariffs on most of the intermediate stuff are relatively low, what they would like to see is more harmonization of standards and of regulatory approaches, because that's now where a lot of the transactions costs are. And so I think there is a lot of interest in trying to move more in that direction, but that's also then where a lot of the civil society angst is coming in and saying, oh wait, but what is that agenda about? We're not really, it's not as clear and transparent as tariffs in terms of, what does regulatory harmonization mean for consumers and not just for the supply chain actors.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We ran a few minutes over. That's my fault. But please join me in thanking our panel, and thanks for being a great audience.